In this video, we will build a realistic sponge. For this, we will build a procedural displacement workflow, set up realistic subsurface scattering materials, and finally build a simple fur setup for additional details. So in this video here, you're going to be learning how to build this simple sponge in here. You will see it's quite an easy process, which just takes a couple of minutes basically. We're going to be building a procedural displacement map here to get those details into the sponge, and then build a simple shader to get this kind of like sponge-like subsurface scattering appearance here, and even build a simple fur setup for some of the part of the sponge. As usual, you can always find all of my scene files on my Patreon if you want to tag along. And you can also see a whole course on car rendering and also lots of other additional goodies. So check this out if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, let's just jump into the tutorial and see how we can do that. So right now we would be at our starting point, and you can see that I already set up here this simple model, which I just generated using a cylinder, and then just use some booleans here to cut these kind of holes in here. And then I used some retopology tools from 3ds Max to just get a little bit better and cleaner geometry, because we're going to be using some displacement. So some nicer topology is always better because it prevents you from having some kind of issues down the line. So this is basically here our starting point in terms of the modeling. And I just set up this simple scene in here. You can see we have just a very simple lighting setup here for the scene. We have a light that's coming here from this side, and then especially we have a quite bright light that's coming from the back in here. And that's quite important later on because we're going to be adding some subsurface scattering materials here. And this will help a lot to sell the look because we have a bright light source here in the back, which allows the light to be scattered here inside the model later on. But right now we're not at the point to apply some shaders yet because we have this very simplistic model. You can see there's even the edges in here visible. And we need to work first on getting a kind of nice model here going on. So let's add a simple displacement modifier here. And this will help us a lot to generate this kind of like sponge-like texture. We're going to be using a fully procedural workflow, so no texture painting or anything like this required. And I also have a tutorial that goes into the depth of the VRay displacement modifier. So we're going to be skipping over some of the parts of it and not go into all of the details in here. But I think most of the stuff is also kind of self-explaining. So VRay offers different types of displacement, and in this tutorial we're going to be using the 3D mapping in here because that's enough in order to get a nice result, and it renders also quite fast. And you can see the difference is that if I switch here to subdivision, it's actually really subdividing here this model. You can see all of those edges here are disappearing, and that's basically quite nice. But in our case, you will notice that there's not really a big difference once we add some smaller details in here, and the 3D mapping here renders really a lot faster compared to this subdivision approach in here. So let's use this instead. And now we can start to apply some simple textures in here because at the moment there's no texture here loaded. So let's use a simple composite matte, and then let's instance that into our material editor so that we have a starting point. I use a composite map because I want to layer different kind of procedural nodes on top of each other. And let's now start with the most basic one. And this one here would be a simple noise, just a standard 3ds Max noise. And you can see once I apply this, something here happens. It doesn't really look exactly like what we want because at the moment here, the size is basically way too big. So let's use a smaller size of 1, for example. And then once we do this, you can see we have some kind of like more details in here going on. Let's use the turbulence mode. And once we do this, you can see it looks already better basically. And now we can play with the high and low levels. So I will raise the low levels to 0.25. And this will basically get rid of a lot of the displacement parts. And we have this kind of like splotches that are appearing here, while some other parts are completely flat. And that's basically exactly what I want to use as a base layer. The issue is that from now, actually everything is kind of inverted. We want to have these kind of like dots which are coming out here, pushing in actually, so we can just swap these two colors in here. Then once we do this, we can see that now we have something that is actually pushing in. But now the whole sponge here basically pushed outwards and it doesn't really look like what we want. And in order to fix this, we can play here with our amount and especially our shift value. So let's use an amount of 0.7, for example, and this will basically not push everything out so much. And now the most important thing is the shift amount in here, and we can just use a negative of the amount in here, so negative 0.7 in my case. And once we do this, you can see we have the original volume here of our sponge, but we have now these kind of large scale holes in here, which are pushed inwards and kind of break up the overall shape of our sponge. So now we have some large scale details going on, but I want to have some kind of smaller details also. And for this, let's go up one level. So we're back in our composite. Let's add a new layer. Let's take the same texture in here. Let's copy that, not use an instance, but copy that because I want to use the same values here as a starting point. Now I just want to have a smaller size going on. So let's use, for example, 0.275. So we have a lot more of those smaller holes now going on, and they cut in quite deep. And I also want to blend them together with my base material. So I can just go in and basically reduce the opacity here to, let's say, 50%. And then we will have a kind of hybrid between our bigger parts here. You can see those bigger holes and those smaller holes in here. So this looks already quite nice, but we still have some parts here which are not displaced at all. And I want to also add a little bit more smaller details in here. So let's go again and add one layer. Let's take this texture here as a base, and then let's go in and change the size once again to 0.1. And now you can see we have a lot of those small holes in here. Let's go up one level, and then let's blend this together with our other two textures. And then I think like this, we have quite a nice sponge-like appearance here already, where we have these bigger holes which are cutting in. We have some smaller holes, and it basically just has a nice variation here on our whole surface. So at the moment we have the same displacement going on for the whole sponge, but I want to have kind of two different layers of a sponge, where one part has a slightly different appearance. And for this, I will select here the sponge, go to the editable poly, and I already selected here the whole back part of the sponge. And I basically just applied a different material ID. So this one has an ID of 2, and this one here has a material ID of 1. So for this, in our composite, let's add once again one more layer. Let's take the same texture and copy that as a base. And then let's change once again here the size to 0.05. And let's also play with a low value, for example, 0.15. And then once we do this, you can see we have this very, very small details now going on, which almost look like some kind of hair or fur. So now we want to make sure that those parts are only applied to all the parts that use material ID of 2. So we can do that by using a VRay multi subtexture node in here. Let's change the amount of slots to 1. The default color will be black, so we're not going to apply this. And then only stuff that has a ID of 2 here will have this completely white color. So basically just apply those texture maps here in all of the parts that have the material ID of 2 in here. Let's go up in our composite. And now if we want to, we can even blend that with our additional details down here. So let's use, for example, 50% of blending. And you can see that now those details here will be blended with all of those details in here. We have kind of like this 2-layer effect going on, where we have bigger parts up here and then smaller parts down here basically. So this is as far as I want to push it with the displacement map now for this video. And now it's time to work on the shader to get some nice sponge-like appearance here going on. On a quick side note, I'm happy to tell you that Chaos decided to support viewers of my channel by offering an exclusive 20% discount on your VRay license. So you can get this by visiting this link down here or by scanning this QR code. By doing this, you will be forwarded to an exclusive area on the Chaos website, where once again you can verify that you can get 20% off your VRay license. And if you scroll down, you should be able to see the discounted prices in here. So if you take this offer, you can save yourself 20% and also support my channel by doing so. Just mind that this offer is temporary, so just verify that the offer still exists at the time you stumble upon this video in here. And now let's go back to the content. So now, after having finished the displacement for our model, we can start with the actual shading. And for this, I have this simple dummy material here loaded in our material editor. And as a first step, I just want to introduce two different color tones. So I want to have yellow color for those parts in here. And then for the backside and those kind of finer details in here, I want to have a blue color tone. And for this, I prepared this simple VRay multi subtexture already, where basically everything that has an ID of 2 will get this kind of blue color and everything else will get this yellow color here applied to. Let's apply this now to our diffuse slot of the material. And you can see now we have already two different color tones going on in here. So since we're dealing with a sponge and it's an extremely rough surface, we're not going to be adding any kind of reflection here in our shader, but instead we're going to be playing with our sheen values in here. So let's use a sheen color of white. And you can see that we have this kind of sheen effect now going on. I think like this, it's too much. So I just want to have it at the very glancing angles basically. So we just have this kind of like white color tones here at those parts. At the moment, I feel this effect is maybe too strong, but as soon as we're gonna start to introduce subsurface scattering, this effect here will be reduced quite a lot. And then we can see if we need to do some further adjustments for that. So at the moment, our shader doesn't look at all like a sponge, and that's because we don't really have any subsurface scattering component in our shader. But luckily, the VRay material has all of the required features built in directly. So we can switch this translucency mode from none to subsurface scattering in our case. And then once we do this, you can see we have a very different kind of effect already. So it basically looks like snow right now, and that's because the subsurface scattering color is set to pure white. And also the subsurface scattering amount is set to 1. So if I would lower the amount here to 0, then we will lose all of our subsurface scattering effect. And if I put, for example, a value of 0.75 in here, we will still have some of our diffuse components. So you can see there's some parts which are still a little bit yellow and a little bit blue, but for the majority of the thing, it's still completely white. And now instead of using this simple white color, we can also just use our same color multi subtexture in here and put this into the subsurface scattering color. And now you can see we have already a much nicer effect here going on. If I want to, I can even raise this value here to 1, so we don't have any diffuse component. And then we can also play with our scale. So if I raise the scale, for example, to 3 centimeters, you can see that the light can now go inside or scatter inside of our sponge a lot further. In our case, let's use maybe a value of 1.5 centimeters. And then I think this looks a little bit better. And let's put the subsurface scattering amount to 0.75, because if we only use subsurface scattering, we will lose our sheen effect. And I think like this, it's a nice hybrid between the two, because it will further help to enhance a little bit the details here on the surface. So since I feel that the sponge still looks a bit too transparent, I want to play with the scatter radius in here. And for this, let's also use the multi-subtexture in here. And instead of just piping that in directly, let's just use a simple color correction. And then let's take this and pipe that into the scatter radius here of our shader. So you can see this already helps to basically eliminate a little bit of this super translucent effect. We can see all of those details in here, and it doesn't look so transparent basically anymore. But let's further play with this. So in the color correction, we can, for example, boost here the RGB value to something like 300, and we can change the hue slightly and maybe also the saturation to -50. And then this would be the effect that we're getting. You can see if I remove this, I feel that overall it loses a little bit too much of the shape. And if I apply this again, then I feel that overall we have a much more realistic appearance, because it doesn't look so transparent anymore. And it still keeps all of this kind of subsurface scattering effect. And by just shifting the color value slightly, we can get some more interesting scattering effects here in our sponge. So lastly, let's check out the two different illumination methods which are offered. So at the moment we use this uniform method. That renders much faster, but it's technically less physically accurate because it doesn't really take the directionality of the lights into account. So there's also this directional method. So once we use this, we get a slightly different effect, as you can see, but on the expense of render time. So in this case, let's just use the uniform mode in here, because I think in our case that is basically sufficient. So that's as far as I want to push it with the shader in this tutorial. And now let's work a little bit on adding some additional fur here on those blue parts, so we can get an even more clear separation between these two different surfaces in here. So now as a little bonus, let's add some fur on those blue parts here of the sponge. So for this, let's just go to the Create tab, and then in the modifier VRay tab, we can just easily apply this VRayFur modifier to it. And you can see that we have a lot of fur here appearing on our entire model. At the moment, the color is wrong. We just have this greenish color tone in here. That's because by default, it uses the mesh color here of the fur object. And in our case, that's not what we want. So let's just apply this kind of blue color tone in here. And I just used a VRay Hair Next material. And let's apply this to our fur now. You can see that the fur now has the correct color, but the problem is that the fur is on the entire object at the moment. That's not really what we want. We only want to have it in those blue parts. So in the placement tab in here, you can select to only have the fur appear on all the parts that use material ID of 2. And then once that's done, you can see that our fur now is only in those blue parts here of the sponge. And that's exactly what we wanted in this case. So if you want to learn more about the VRayFur system or also the VRay Hair Next material, you're lucky. In my channel, you can find multiple videos about this topic. And if you watch this video until here, chances are that you're also going to enjoy the content that I provide over on my Patreon, where you can download all of my scene files for all of my tutorials, watch additional bonus content, or watch an entire course on car rendering. So check that out if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, see you next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.